The roar of aircraft engines fell silent as Sarah Bennett climbed into the cockpit, met with snickers and eye rolls from the all-male veteran pilots who'd been dominating the prestigious aviation camp for decades. Little did they know that this simple woman they'd been ignoring all week was about to execute a perfect inverted flat spin recovery that would shatter the camp's long-standing aerial record and change aviation history forever. Butterflies swarmed in Sarah's stomach as she adjusted her seat, aware of the critical eyes watching her every move. Dressed in a plain blue jumpsuit that contrasted sharply with the custom-embroidered flight suit surrounding her, she ran her fingers across the control panel with surprising familiarity. The elite Aviation Academy sparkled under bright summer skies, its hangars housing the most advanced training aircraft money could buy. "Need help finding the ignition, sweetheart?" Parker Reynolds called out, his deep laugh echoing across the tarmac. At 45, the five-time national aerobatics champion wore his success like expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. His perfectly styled hair didn't move in the breeze as he leaned against his custom-painted aircraft, arms crossed over his designer flight suit covered in sponsor patches. Sarah said nothing, focusing instead on her pre-flight checks with methodical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Parker announced loudly to the gathering crowd of wealthy students, "today we witness what happens when the admission standards slip." His friends laughed on cue, their voices carrying across the airfield. $10,000 says she can't even get this bird off the ground without help. Margaret Wilson, the operations director, frowned deeply. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she stepped forward. "That's enough, Reynolds. Everyone deserves a fair chance." Parker waved dismissively. "Fair chance? This isn't cooking class, Margaret. Lives are at stake up there." Sarah completed her checks, her movements revealing an unexpected confidence that briefly silenced the mockery. Her fingers touched the simple gold locket hanging around her neck, a private gesture that no one understood. Dave Miller, the flight instructor assigned to oversee her first flight, approached with skepticism written across his weathered face. "Ms. Bennett, we'll just do basic maneuvers today. Nobody expects—" "I understand the protocol," Sarah interrupted quietly, her voice calm despite the hostile environment. "I've studied the flight manual thoroughly." Parker couldn't resist one final jab. "Studying and doing are worlds apart, honey. Some people just aren't built for this kind of pressure." Sarah finally looked directly at him, her gray eyes steady. "I'd like to proceed with today's assessment, if that's all right with you, Mr. Reynolds." Something in her composed demeanor momentarily unsettled Parker. He recovered quickly, flashing his camera-ready smile. "By all means. We could all use some entertainment." The engine roared to life under Sarah's capable hands. She taxied to the runway with surprising precision, her radio communications crisp and professional. The crowd expected hesitation, perhaps even fear, but Sarah's movements showed neither. "Tower, this is Training Aircraft 37, ready for takeoff," she radioed, her voice betraying no nervousness. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, even Parker fell silent. The takeoff was flawless, no wobble, no uncertainty, just a smooth ascent that seemed impossible for a beginner. In the control tower, Margaret exchanged glances with the head instructor. "That doesn't look like someone's first solo," he muttered. Once airborne, Sarah felt a familiar sense of peace replace the tension. Up here, away from judging eyes, she was free. She completed the standard assessment pattern perfectly, then requested permission for additional maneuvers. "Training 37, this is Tower. Did you request aerobatic clearance?" The controller couldn't hide his surprise. "Affirmative, Tower. Requesting clearance for basic rolls and loops in the designated area." On the ground, Parker's confident smirk faded as he watched Sarah's aircraft begin maneuvers that surpassed basic training standards. Instead of the hesitant attempts expected from a newcomer, her loops were perfectly circular, her rolls precisely controlled. "Where the hell did she learn to fly like that?" someone whispered. Nobody noticed the small tear that escaped Sarah's eye as she executed a perfect barrel roll. Nobody except perhaps the ghost of the man who had taught her, whose memory flew with her in that simple gold locket containing a small metal fragment from the experimental aircraft that had claimed his life 3 years earlier. Sarah's aircraft touched down with picture-perfect precision, tires kissing the runway with barely a sound. The crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation stood in stunned silence, their expectations shattered by the display of skill they'd just witnessed. Dave Miller, supposed to be monitoring her basic flight, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. That was... He struggled for words as Sarah powered down the engine. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah removed her headset, her expression calm despite the triumph she'd just achieved. "My husband was a pilot," she answered simply. "He taught me the basics." Parker Reynolds pushed through the gathering crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Basics? Nobody flies perfect Cuban 8s with basics. What game are you playing, Bennett?" Before Sarah could answer, Margaret Wilson stepped between them. "The assessment is complete, and Ms. Bennett has more than qualified for the advanced program. Congratulations," she added, offering her hand to Sarah. Parker wasn't finished. "One lucky flight doesn't make her a pilot. The real training starts tomorrow, and we'll see how long this beginner's luck lasts." His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Sarah. "You don't belong here. This is a world built by men like me, not housewives playing pilot." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her assigned quarters, the small cabin on the edge of the airfield housing the Academy's non-wealthy students. Unlike the luxury apartments where Parker and his friends stayed, these were practical spaces with minimal comfort. She opened her worn leather bag and carefully removed an old leather-bound journal. The name embossed on the cover had faded with time: Colonel James Bennett, USAF Test Pilot Division. Sarah ran her fingers over the lettering, then opened to pages filled with detailed flight notes, diagrams, and personal observations. The handwriting was precise, the mark of a man who understood that in aviation, precision meant survival. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah quickly closed the journal, tucking it beneath her pillow before answering. Margaret Wilson stood outside, her professional demeanor softened by genuine curiosity. "May I come in, Ms. Bennett? I think we should talk." Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside. Margaret entered, her eyes sweeping the Spartan room before settling on the framed photograph beside Sarah's bed. A man in military flight gear standing beside an experimental aircraft. "Your husband?" Margaret asked, though it wasn't really a question. Sarah nodded. "James Bennett. He died 3 years ago." Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. "Colonel James Bennett? The test pilot from Project Horizon." Sarah's surprise was evident. "You knew of him?" "Every serious aviation professional knows that name," Margaret replied, sitting on the room's single chair. "His work on high-altitude recovery techniques revolutionized safety protocols. The report said his aircraft suffered catastrophic system failure during testing." "That's what the official statement said," Sarah confirmed, her voice carefully neutral. She touched the locket around her neck, a gesture Margaret noticed but didn't comment on. "Your performance today wasn't beginner's luck," Margaret stated. "He taught you, didn't he?" Sarah looked out the small window toward the darkening airfield. James believed everyone should understand the fundamentals of flight, not just the theory but the feeling. We spent hundreds of hours in simulators and small aircraft whenever his testing schedule allowed. "Parker Reynolds won't take today's surprise well," Margaret warned. "His entire identity is built around being the best, the most naturally gifted pilot at this academy. You've threatened that narrative." "I didn't come here to threaten anyone," Sarah replied. I came because it was time to keep a promise I made. As Margaret left, her parting words carried both warning and respect. Whatever your reasons, you've certainly made an impression. But be careful. Reynolds has powerful friends and considerable influence with the board. This is just the beginning. After Margaret's departure, Sarah retrieved her husband's journal, opening to his final entries. Among detailed notes about aircraft performance and system modifications was a personal message that had guided her since his death. Sarah, if you're reading this, something went wrong. Remember what I always taught you. In aviation, there's no hiding behind privilege or connections. The sky demands honesty, skill, and respect. Keep flying. For both of us. What Sarah didn't yet know was that Parker Reynolds was already making calls, instructing his assistant to dig into her background, find weaknesses, create obstacles. And what Parker didn't realize was that the simple gold locket around Sarah's neck contained evidence that could connect his family's aviation company to the equipment failure that had killed one of America's finest test pilots. A connection that would turn their aviation rivalry into something far more dangerous than either anticipated. Raindrops pelted the memorial stone as Sarah stood alone 3 years earlier, watching military personnel move with precise, rehearsed movements around her husband's flag-draped casket. Thunder rolled across Arlington National Cemetery, nature's salute to a fallen pilot. The official report cited catastrophic systems failure during routine testing of the experimental XF-92 aircraft, but the classified details would remain locked away, just like the truth. He spoke of you constantly, a deep voice said beside her. Sarah turned to find Captain Marcus Daniels, James's wingman for nearly a decade. His uniform remained perfectly pressed despite the downpour, his face a mask of controlled grief. The guys called him the Professor because he was always teaching someone something, Marcus continued. But when he talked about teaching you to fly, his voice cracked slightly. That's when he lit up the most. Marcus pressed something small and cold into her palm, a twisted piece of metal no larger than a quarter. This was recovered from the crash site. Analysis identified it as part of the primary control system manufactured by Reynolds Aviation Equipment. James had flagged it for replacement twice before the accident. Sarah stared at the fragment. Reynolds, as in Parker Reynolds. His family's company. They supply critical components to military aircraft. Marcus's jaw tightened. The investigation was shut down before we could prove anything conclusive, but those of us who flew with James know their parts had problems. Now, as Sarah prepared for her second day at the Elite Aviation Academy, this memory burned bright. The metal fragment from the control system hung inside her locket, a physical connection to James and a reminder of questions that remained unanswered. The briefing room buzzed with conversation that instantly died when Sarah entered. Yesterday's demonstration of skill had transformed her from an object of ridicule to something more complicated, a threat to the established order. Parker Reynolds arrived last, his entourage trailing behind him like expensive shadows. His smile appeared friendly to those who didn't notice the coldness in his eyes. Good morning, everyone. Today we begin high-G maneuver training. He scanned the room, gaze stopping at Sarah. Ms. Bennett, given your unexpected performance yesterday, I've assigned you to the advanced rotation. You'll be practicing reverse Cuban 8s with intentional recovery challenges. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's third-week material, Parker. She seems quite advanced, Parker replied with false generosity. No sense holding back exceptional talent, right? Sarah recognized the trap, pushing her toward increasingly difficult maneuvers until she failed, discrediting her early success as beginner's luck. I appreciate the opportunity, she replied evenly. During pre-flight, Dave Miller approached her with concern. The aircraft assigned to you has been modified for today's exercise. The control response will be deliberately dampened to simulate recovery challenges. I understand, Sarah replied, completing her checks with a thoroughness James had drilled into her. My husband trained for worst-case scenarios. He made sure I understood the principles. Dave's curiosity got the better of him. Your husband was clearly more than just a casual pilot. Who was he, if you don't mind me asking? Sarah hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. He tested experimental aircraft. He believed understanding failure modes was as important as mastering normal operations. High above the academy grounds, Sarah put the modified aircraft through increasingly challenging maneuvers. Each time the controls fought against her, she adjusted with a calm efficiency that left Dave speechless beside her. "That's not standard recovery technique," he finally commented as she pulled out of a particularly difficult sequence. "No," Sarah acknowledged. "It's a modified approach for compromised control systems." On the ground, Parker watched through binoculars, his frustration growing with each successful recovery. "This is impossible," he muttered to his assistant. "Find out everything about her husband. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with." As Sarah landed, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Reynolds has accessed military personnel records. He knows who James was. Be careful, MD." Parker's voice crackled over the radio as she taxied toward the hangar. "Excellent flying today, Bennett. Tomorrow we'll try something more challenging. Emergency procedures in the simulator. Let's see how you handle complete system failure." What he didn't say, but Sarah instantly understood, was that tomorrow's simulation would be anything but standard. The game had escalated from simple humiliation to something far more personal and potentially dangerous. Simulation lights flashed red as alarms blared through the cockpit. Sarah's hands moved steadily across controls that fought against her inputs while Parker Reynolds watched from the operator's station, a satisfied smile pulling at his lips. The emergency scenario running in the high-fidelity simulator wasn't merely difficult. It was nearly impossible, designed specifically to force failure. Hydraulic systems compromised, electrical grid failing, and now your right engine is flaming out, Parker announced through the intercom, not bothering to hide his enjoyment. "Standard protocols won't save you now, Bennett." Other students and instructors had gathered to witness what Parker had loudly proclaimed would be a reality check for our amateur pilot. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to discomfort at the obvious setup. Instead of panic, Sarah felt a strange calm descend, the same focused state James had described from his most challenging missions. She abandoned conventional recovery sequences, implementing instead a technique James had developed specifically for cascading systems failures in experimental aircraft. The simulated aircraft stabilized, defying the programmed disaster. Parker's smile vanished. He punched additional failure modes into the system while maintaining a professional tone. Engine 2 now completely failed, cabin pressure dropping, navigation systems offline. Margaret Wilson entered the simulation room, immediately noting the unusually severe scenario. "Parker, what exactly are you running here? This doesn't match any approved training sequence." "Just testing our star students' limits," Parker replied without looking away from the monitors, which showed Sarah still maintaining controlled flight despite impossible conditions. When the simulation finally ended, silence filled the room. Sarah had managed to land the crippled aircraft with minimal damage, a feat even seasoned pilots would struggle to accomplish. She removed the simulation headset, her expression neutral despite the visible perspiration on her forehead. "Impressive recovery technique," Dave Miller commented, unable to hide his admiration. "I've never seen that approach taught in any civilian program." Parker's voice cut through the murmurs of approval. "That's because it wasn't civilian training. It was military, specifically experimental aircraft protocols." His eyes locked with Sarah's. "Isn't that right, Mrs. Bennett? Or should I call you the widow of Colonel James, the Professor Bennett, lead test pilot for Project Horizon?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Sarah. She maintained her composure despite the deliberate exposure of her private history. Yes, my husband was Colonel Bennett of the Advanced Flight Testing Division. He taught me many things about aircraft safety and recovery techniques before his death. Parker circled her like a predator sensing weakness. How convenient that you failed to mention this relevant background when applying to our academy. One might almost think you had reasons to hide your connection to a classified military project. My application listed my experience accurately, Sarah replied evenly. My relationship to my late husband wasn't relevant to my qualifications. Perhaps not, Parker continued, his voice hardening. But your presence at this specific academy, where my family's company has significant connections, seems less like coincidence and more like investigation. The accusation hung in the air. Margaret stepped forward, professional concern overriding her typically reserved demeanor. That's enough, Reynolds. Ms. Bennett's personal history doesn't justify this treatment. Parker's false smile returned. Of course not. I merely think transparency serves everyone's interests. He turned back to Sarah. Tomorrow's exercise involves emergency landings after equipment failure. Ironically, the very scenario that killed your husband. I'm sure you'll find it educational. After the others departed, Margaret approached Sarah privately. Reynolds is deliberately pushing boundaries. His family's company has financial stakes in the academy, and the board typically supports him, but this vendetta is becoming dangerous. It's not about me, Sarah explained quietly. It's about what I represent, a connection to a crash investigation that was suspiciously shut down before responsibility could be assigned. That evening, Sarah received a visitor in her quarters. Captain Daniels had arrived unannounced, his military bearing unchanged but his expression grave. Reynolds has accelerated his timeline, Marcus reported, keeping his voice low. He's modified tomorrow's training aircraft with control variations similar to those we suspect caused James's crash. Not enough to cause failure, but enough to prove a point. Sarah absorbed this information, twisting her wedding ring, a gesture of centering she'd developed since James's death. He's recreating elements of the accident. Marcus nodded. He wants you to fail publicly, discrediting both you and potentially any reopened investigation into his family's company. Then I can't fail, Sarah replied simply. There's more, Marcus continued. The Department of Defense has quietly reopened parts of the investigation into Project Horizon. Reynolds Aviation is under renewed scrutiny, and Parker's been called to testify next month. Sarah's eyes widened with sudden understanding. So this isn't just about wounded pride or maintaining his exclusive club. No, Marcus confirmed. It's about protecting his family's company from potential negligence charges that could cost them billions in contracts and settlements. He paused. If James's notes on the equipment failures ever became public. Sarah's fingers closed around her locket, feeling the small metal fragment inside. Physical evidence from the crash that had never been included in official reports. What exactly is scheduled for tomorrow's exercise? Inverted flat spin recovery with compromised control surfaces, Marcus replied. The exact condition that preceded James's crash. A chill ran through Sarah despite the warm evening. He's not just testing me. He's sending a message. Aircraft wheels lifted off the runway as Sarah Bennett began the most dangerous flight of her life. The modified training jet, deliberately adjusted to create handling issues similar to those suspected in her husband's fatal crash, climbed steadily through scattered clouds toward the designated test area. Her heartbeat remained steady despite knowing that Parker Reynolds had prepared a trap designed to publicly break her. Tower, this is training 6-4 at 4,000 feet, proceeding to exercise zone, Sarah radioed, her voice revealing none of the tension coiling inside her. Roger 6-4, came the reply. Be advised, Mr. Reynolds will monitor from chase position in Training 7-2. Sure enough, Parker's sleek aircraft appeared off her wing, close enough for Sarah to see his confident smile through the canopy. His voice filled her headset. Beautiful day for some inverted flat spin recovery, wouldn't you say, Bennett? Let's see if the professor's widow can handle what he couldn't. Every pilot within radio range heard the taunt. Margaret Wilson's voice cut through the awkward silence from the tower. Reynolds, maintain professional communications or return to base immediately. Sarah ignored the provocation, focusing instead on meticulously testing the aircraft's responses. Just as Marcus had warned, the control surfaces felt sluggish, with a subtle but dangerous lag between input and reaction, almost identical to the issues James had documented before his final flight. Beginning exercise profile, Sarah announced, climbing to the designated altitude. The test called for deliberately inducing a flat spin, among the most disorienting and difficult to recover situations a pilot could face, and then demonstrating proper recovery technique. Parker's voice returned, professionally detached now that others were listening. 6-4, recommend you extend the spin for minimum of 5 seconds before recovery to demonstrate full control. Sarah recognized the dangerous suggestion immediately. In an aircraft with compromised controls, extending a flat spin would make recovery nearly impossible. Negative. 7-2. Standard protocol is 3 seconds maximum. She rolled inverted, then expertly triggered the spin conditions. The aircraft responded badly, spinning more violently than standard parameters would predict. The G-forces pressed Sarah hard against her harness as the horizon whirled in her vision. 1 second. 2 seconds. The controls fought against her recovery inputs. Having trouble, Bennett? Parker's mock-concerned voice came through the radio. Perhaps this is too advanced after all. Sarah didn't waste breath responding. Instead, she executed a recovery sequence that wasn't in any civilian manual, a technique James had developed specifically for compromised aircraft, documented only in his personal notes. The spinning slowed, then stopped, leaving the aircraft in a controlled descent. Recovery complete, she reported calmly, though sweat beaded her forehead beneath her helmet. Returning to pattern altitude. Parker's voice had lost its mocking edge. Where did you learn that recovery technique? It's not standard procedure. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. My husband developed it after identifying control issues in the XF-92 project, issues caused by defective parts from Reynolds Aviation that he reported 3 times before his crash. Silence filled the radio. When Parker finally responded, his voice was tight with anger. Those allegations were never proven. You're threading dangerous ground, Bennett. No, Reynolds, Sarah countered steadily. Dangerous ground is supplying faulty equipment to experimental aircraft, then covering up the evidence when pilots die. Back on the ground, an unexpected group awaited Sarah's return. 2 men in dark suits standing beside Margaret Wilson, their government credentials visible even from a distance. As Sarah completed her perfect landing, she noticed Parker's aircraft diverting from the pattern, heading toward the private hangar area rather than the main runway. Ms. Bennett, the taller of the 2 men said as she approached. I'm Special Agent Thomas from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. We'd like to talk about the flight characteristics you just experienced, and how they compare to your husband's notes regarding Project Horizon. Margaret stepped forward. We've been monitoring the modifications made to your aircraft, Sarah. Every adjustment Reynolds ordered has been documented and matches the pattern of issues your husband reported before his accident. Sarah removed her flight helmet, her composure maintained despite the morning's dangers. I believe I have something that might help your investigation, she said quietly, reaching for the locket that had hung around her neck for 3 years, protecting a small piece of evidence that might finally bring truth to light. Fresh paint gleamed on the sign outside the renamed Bennett Flight Academy as students gathered for the first day of classes. 12 months had transformed not just the name but the entire culture of what had once been the most exclusive flying club in the country. Sarah Bennett stood at the podium, sunlight streaming through tall windows behind her as she addressed the diverse group before her: military veterans, women of all ages, people of color, and even a young man in a wheelchair equipped with adaptive flying controls. "Welcome to your advanced certification course," Sarah began, her confidence now matching her skill. "Today marks the beginning of your journey toward becoming not just pilots, but aviation leaders who understand that safety, integrity, and excellence matter more than privilege or connections." The journey to this moment had been far from smooth. After Sarah's demonstration flight revealed the deliberate aircraft modifications matching those in her husband's doomed plane, the Department of Defense investigation had accelerated rapidly. Reynolds' aviation stock plummeted when sealed documents became public, revealing years of cost-cutting measures that compromised safety while maximizing profit. Parker Reynolds himself faced both criminal charges and civil lawsuits, his attempt to flee to his family's private island thwarted when Margaret Wilson alerted authorities to his hastily arranged flight plan. His testimony, given in exchange for reduced penalties, exposed a corporate culture that valued profit over safety and reputation over responsibility. Rather than simply bringing down a corrupt system, Sarah had focused on building something better in its place. When the elite Aviation Academy faced bankruptcy following the scandal, she partnered with Captain Marcus Daniels and several of James's former colleagues to transform it into a school that emphasized safety, accessibility, and innovation. After orientation, Margaret approached Sarah in the newly renovated simulator room. 3 more adaptive pilots earned their certifications this month, she reported, now serving as the Academy's head of operations. The James Bennett Safety Foundation has approved funding for 2 additional specialized aircraft. Sarah nodded, satisfaction warming her expression. "And the new emergency recovery protocols?" "Officially adopted by the FAA last week," Margaret confirmed. "Every pilot in the country will now learn the techniques your husband developed." That afternoon, Sarah climbed into a small aerobatic aircraft for a solo flight, not to prove anything to anyone, but for the pure joy of connection with the sky. At 10,000 feet, she leveled off and executed a perfect barrel roll, feeling James's presence as strongly as the controls beneath her hands. "We did it," she whispered into the slipstream. "Your work will save lives." Banking into the afternoon sun, she spotted a school bus arriving at the academy, a group of young girls from an urban science program coming for their first introduction to aviation. Sarah dipped her wing in greeting, completing the circle that had begun with rejection and ended with inclusion. Later, as the day's light faded, Dave Miller found Sarah in the hangar, making final adjustments to a training aircraft. "You know," he said, leaning against the fuselage, "when you first arrived, I thought Parker was right about you not belonging here." Sarah glanced up from her work. "And now?" Dave's weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "Now I understand it wasn't about belonging in his world. It was about creating a better one." Sarah ran her hand along the aircraft's smooth surface. "James used to say that flying strips away everything superficial. In the air, it doesn't matter what you look like, where you came from, or who your family is. All that matters is skill, judgment, and respect for the physics that keep you alive." As evening settled across the airfield, a reporter approached for Sarah's scheduled interview about the Academy's 1-year anniversary. "Mrs. Bennett, when you first came to the elite Aviation Academy, did you plan to expose the safety violations that led to its transformation?" Sarah shook her head. "I came to keep a promise to my husband, to continue flying despite my grief. Everything else happened because one man couldn't accept that a simple woman might actually belong in what he considered his exclusive domain." The reporter scribbled notes. "And your message for others who might feel excluded from fields where they don't match the traditional image?" Sarah's gaze lifted toward the darkening sky. "Skills aren't defined by appearance or background. Excellence can come from unexpected places. And sometimes the most powerful response to those who underestimate you isn't confrontation, but quietly proving them wrong with such undeniable skill that they're forced to question everything they thought they knew. For those who had witnessed Sarah's journey from being dismissed at the elite aviation academy to confidently leading the institution that replaced it, the lesson was crystal clear. Never judge someone's abilities by their appearance. Behind quiet determination might lie extraordinary talent, unwavering values, and the courage to transform not just their own path, but an entire broken system.